Welcome to the motivation module. In this presentation, I want to cover the behavioral theories from the motivation chapter, and I want to start with Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was born in 1849 and died in 1936. He was a Russian physiologist, and he was actually studying the physiology of digestion. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1904, and his experiments were on stomach secretions in dogs. And what he discovered by accident was the mere sight of food caused the dog to salivate. So the dogs were associating the sight of food and not only that, they're hearing the approach of the researcher with being fed. Here's an example of how he'd set his experiment up. It's called classical conditioning. There's some synonyms that we use for this, and you'll hear the term Pavlovian conditioning or respondent conditioning. Two-term contingency. The two terms are stimulus and response, that's it. In other words, it doesn't matter what happens after the response. And this is learning by association through repeated pairings. Also type S learnings. All of these mean the same thing. So now John Watson was a founder of behaviorism, and he thought psychology should focus on behavior. And he had a famous experiment with an infant that was name was Albert, and the experiment is referred to as Little Albert. And he introduced a rat to Little Albert, and then he'd get behind him and bang pans real loud. And so this caused Albert to fear the rat. Not only that, anything that felt like or looked like the rat. All right, so the actual terms we're dealing with here are unconditioned stimulus, which elicits a natural and automatic response, and that's the unconditioned response. And then that stimulus gets paired with a neutral stimulus, and that becomes the conditioned stimulus, which eventually the conditioned stimulus will elicit the conditioned response. As I said earlier, there's only two terms, stimulus and response. Extinction happens when the conditioned stimulus no longer elicits the response. Now here's some examples. When I was a kid growing up, we used to go to my grandmother's house for holidays, and she would always be baking a pumpkin pie. So even to today, when I smell a pumpkin pie being baked, it makes me think of my grandmother. In other words, the smell of pumpkin pie is the conditioned stimulus, and it elicits that response of being with my grandmother. For a lot of kids, hearing a bell ring, they associate that with, say, like lunch break at school, because schools do the bells. For a lot of us, you go to a movie theater, and right away you think of popcorn and a drink because you're going to watch a movie. Being with certain people, having a routine, like hearing a song and thinking of someone in particular, that's a really common response. You know, our animals become conditioned too. Like, for example, if I pick up the leash, then my dog heads for the door because he thinks we're going to go for a walk. Classical conditioning, it happens every day to every person. It's also the basis for phobias. In other words, the phobias are people who have been classically conditioned by a traumatic experience. And typically that happens when they're very young. For example, a common one is people who have a fear of clowns, and that goes back to when they were young children and they were frightened by a clown. So the sense of smell is the most powerful of the senses for conditioning. And this can be managed and used as a resource. Now, people who smoke are conditioned to light up their cigarettes. That's why it's so difficult to stop smoking. For example, when they wake up in the morning, they have to light up a cigarette. When they're drinking coffee, they have to smoke a cigarette. When they finish a meal, they have to light a cigarette. When they're on breaks at work, they light cigarettes. And not only that, they hang out with other people who smoke. So when they see those people, they're conditioned to light a cigarette. When driving their cars, they automatically light up. After sex, they light up a cigarette. In response to stress, they light up. And in order to help a person stop smoking, you have to identify all these situations that they've been conditioned to light up cigarettes. And you either have to change the stimulus or change the response. And oftentimes we can't change the stimulus. For example, they can't stop eating. But they could give up drinking coffee for a couple of weeks. They could drink orange juice in the morning, and then that way it wouldn't trigger the response to light a cigarette. So for something like eating, after they eat, they would have to use chewing gum instead of a cigarette. Now, Virginia Satir was a famous psychologist, and she believed that all experiences a person has in their life serve as resources, and they can be accessed cognitively, and you can create a learned association with them. So, for example, try this right now as you watch this video. Think of a time, for example, a high performance or learning hours. Think of a time when you were resourceful in a classroom and you had exceptional retention. And think of that time, and when you get that time in mind, you can close your eyes and think of it, and when you're right in the moment, take your thumb and your finger and squeeze them hard together. All right, then when you come out of that experience, now think of something else, and then squeeze your thumb and finger, and it'll bring that experience back up. So the next time you're in a classroom and you want to have exceptional retention, then you can squeeze your thumb and finger together, and you'll bring that back as a resource state. All right, now, before I get going here on operant conditioning, if you would like to get 5 points of extra credit that I will add to your midterm exam, and if for some reason if you get a perfect score on the midterm exam, I'll add the points to your quizzes. What I want you to do is click reply to this announcement message and describe a situation in your life where you're classically conditioned. And then secondly, describe some situation where you use operant conditioning or have been conditioned by operant conditioning. And I'll explain operant conditioning now. So these don't need to have a lot of words. They can be brief. Just briefly describe a time when you're classically conditioned and when you're operantly conditioned, or when you've used operant conditioning, say for example with your pet. All right, a lot of people, I'm going to talk about operant conditioning. A lot of people thought Skinner just made this up or thought this up on his own, but he actually built on the work of other researchers, and primarily Thorndike. Thorndike was an American. He 1874 to 1949. He was prolific in books, monographs, and journal articles. Trial and error learning was one of his ideas of the most basic learning. He had a theory of connectionism. He laid the groundwork for Skinner's operant conditioning, and Thorndike used a puzzle box with cats, and it looked like this, and he treated his cats very well, by the way, and he would put his cats in this box, and they would figure out how to open the door, and then they would get a food as a reward for solving the puzzle. He also believed learning to be incremental rather than insightful, and that learning is not mediated by ideas, and that all mammals basically learn in the same manner. He had the law of readiness. When someone is ready to perform some act, to do so is satisfying. And when they're ready to perform some act, to not do so is annoying. So when someone is not ready to perform some act and forced to do so, that's annoying as well. He also had the law of exercise, in other words, connections between a stimulus and a response are strengthened as they are used, or what he called the law of use. And the same way they're weakened if they're not used or discontinued, the law of disuse. And Skinner built, I think you can see where Skinner built on these laws. He had the law of effect. If a response is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the strength of the connection is increased. And if it's followed by an annoying state of affairs, it's decreased. And you can see how that motivated Skinner. He also had the principle of polarity. A learned response is most easily given in the direction in which it is formed. For example, most of us learn the alphabet going from A to Z, so if I ask you to cite the alphabet from Z to A, most of us cannot do it. Same way with the Pledge of Allegiance. You learn that in an order. All right, let's talk about Skinner. In Skinner, we refer to it as operant conditioning. Synonyms are Skinnerian psychology, instrumental conditioning, three-term contingency, SRS, behavior modification, the ABCs of behavior. That stood for antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. Reinforcement learning, or type R learning. All these refer to the same process. It's a picture of Skinner here. You can see he lived to 1990. He was his degree was from Harvard. He was a professor at Indiana University. He was known for the Skinner box and also for radical behaviorism. Any response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus tends to be repeated or strengthened, and a stimulus is anything that increases the rate which an operant response occurs, a reinforcing stimulus. Here are the terms I talked about: antecedent, behavior, consequence. Notice this is three terms, so that's the three-term contingency. It's like what happens after the behavior is what makes the difference. And so learning is based upon the consequences. And once again, extinction is elimination of the behavior. Positive reinforcement is adding something after the behavior that strengthens the response, and negative reinforcement is avoiding or removing something that strengthens the response. For example, there was a construction site down the street from me, and if I turned right coming out of my subdivision, there would be a lot of traffic delays. And so I learned to turn left and take a different route, and that was negative reinforcement, because by doing that I was able to avoid all the traffic delays. Positive punishment is presenting something undesired. So notice the word positive is not used as good or bad, it's used as presenting something. So that's like spanking. A parent spanks a child, that's considered positive punishment. What's preferred is negative punishments, the removal of something desired. So you take the child's cell phone away, or the most common example is timeout. You take away playtime, put them in the corner until they straighten out their behavior, and then you give it back. Problems with punishment, they can the person can begin to resent the person who is giving the punishment. That's why psychologists recommend negative punishment and not positive punishment. Schedules of reinforcement, Skinner talked about. Continuous reinforcement is every response. A good example, that's a Coke machine. If you put your money in and the Coke doesn't come out, very few people will put money in again. It's like the behavior stops immediately. Intermittent schedules, reinforcer is not obtained for every response. It's retained in ratios or intervals. And so you can see like a variable ratio. A slot machine is pretty addictive. So you go to a casino and sometimes it pays, sometimes it doesn't, and that person keeps putting their money in whether it pays or not. Skinner thought learning theory should be simple. He once trained a pigeon to peck a lever 10,000 times for one pellet of food. And then it started the next round of 10,000. Operant conditioning is used as a primary way to motivate workers in sales. Almost all organizations use this with their salespeople. And it can be used by a leader to motivate workers. And, I once was consulting in a plant where they wanted to change the agenda of all the teams, and a lot of the teams were working on environmental items, and they wanted to change the agenda to productive items because there was a need at that time. So rather than try to dictate that change, which would create a lot of resistance, we went to the leaders of the teams and set up a reinforcement schedule for them. So any team that changed their agenda and was eligible to win prizes as a result of that. In other words, we would, like the top team every 3 months, everybody would get a free jacket, or a second place for the biggest savings would get a hat, and third place a t-shirt or something like that. And the workers started picking the types of reinforcers that they would be motivated to receive. And so by doing that, we were able to change all the agendas and at the same time motivate the workers, and it made a big difference in the bottom line of the plant. I do have references here at the end, so don't forget, post your response for your extra credit.